Welcome to this session on the Beatles and George Martin. Notice the subtitle here, Retreating or Progressing Toward the Studio. Two different ways of considering this trajectory. What we're going to see, and what I'm sure you probably already know, is that the Beatles by the mid-60s are no longer a touring group. We'll talk about the famous date at Shea Stadium where people were so loud in the audience, and the amplification system was so relatively weak in comparison that they couldn't be heard. They couldn't hear themselves playing. And so it got to the point where they felt that it really was useless for them to tour. That wasn't part of it anymore. Now, it's not that simple of a causality, as we'll see. Right? There were other things coming into play here. But one of the things that's happening over the course of the 60s is we're moving away from popular music as being primarily a singles-oriented affair toward it being an album-oriented form of expression. And we want to think a bit about that today. It's not the case that there weren't albums before, of course. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, they both put out albums in the late 50s, right? Here's Little Richard, and Elvis Presley's album was just called Elvis Presley. And those albums sold relatively well, but they were really collections of singles, either singles that were already released or singles that were about to be released. And they were collections in that way. In fact, that's what an album obviously originally was, right? When you have a photo album, granted, you might have a photo album that has a certain theme, I suppose, but for the most part, the idea of a photo album is just that you're leafing together things. In fact, most photo albums, you can take out each page and reorder it, or, right, replace it, take it out, put in something else. So a photo album is a collection of photos that you've brought together in some packaging. Well, that's what an album originally was as well, right? The first important albums on the cultural scenes that were really albums go back to the 40s and Frank Sinatra, right? The voice of Frank Sinatra, which originally was just a collection of singles that were packaged together. So each single would have an A side and a B side. So you get a song per side, and there were 10 of them, I think, or maybe that's too many. I don't remember exactly how many. The deluxe version, I think, had 10, but the original version probably had fewer. And it was just these collection of singles that you could buy as a package. So it was literally an album. Right? As the long-playing record came into vogue, that changed so that you had this entity. Now, that's part of what we're going to be talking about. That happens over the course of the late 40s into the 50s. And then in the 60s, the conception of what an album is begins to change fairly radically. Let's talk a bit about the Beatles, and then we'll come back to this issue. The early 1960s, just for some cultural context first, is seen by some as the Great Awakening from the dark ages of the American past, an awakening into a greater concern for equality and justice, right? Some of the ideals that we saw last time and talked about with Martin Luther King Jr. and the bus boycott and of course, the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education. And the 60s are seen as a kind of culmination of this by some people, right? That it's an awakening from those dark ages. It's a moment of enlightenment. And it's seen by others, such as the sociologist Daniel Bell, as an era of irresponsibility and an obsession with immediate gratification and exhibitionism. So the early 60s were a pivotal moment, whichever way you see it. They're a pivotal moment in the U.S., in U.S. history, and the way in which U.S. citizens conceived of themselves. Now, there are some, including me, historians, who might think that the 60s get mythologized, that there's too much made of the 60s as this pivotal moment. But even to say that we exaggerate it isn't to take away from the fact that the 60s are this moment of a kind of looking at oneself in the U.S., a way of trying to understand the position of the individual within the U.S. and the U.S. within the world. Right? The U.S. over the course of the 50s is taking more and more of a role in the global sphere, in global politics. After World War I and up through World War II, up through the entry of the U.S. into World War II, the U.S. really focused on a kind of isolationist policy. And really, that goes back in some ways to the Monroe Doctrine. It goes back to the very beginnings of the U.S. The U.S. has a tendency toward isolationism up until 1941. But after World War II, it's much more involved on the global scene and is really becoming, by the 50s, a superpower, right? Where we're starting to see the beginning of what, George W. Bush later thinks of as American responsibility toward freedom with the world, and you can take a cynical view of that or whatever view you have, but the idea that the U.S. ought to be involved in the way that that the world as a whole is shaped and conducts itself, that it has a kind of agency, right? That idea comes into focus in the 1950s and becomes something of a concern, right? Even Eisenhower, on his way out of office, talks about the military-industrial complex, that this idea of U.S. interference in world politics might be something that we should be somewhat suspicious of. So no matter what, the 60s are an important moment, right? Even if it sometimes gets exaggerated on the social cultural level. Social and cultural change accelerates during this time, creating a deepening divide between liberals and conservatives. Indeed, the late 60s was the moment when the modern conservative movement launched in response to the perceived liberalism of the 60s. So our political situation now is largely informed by things that are happening during the 60s. The notion of anti-authoritarianism as the birthright of the American became a common assumption of the 1960s for nearly all citizens. The difference just is who is that authority, right? Both the liberals and the conservatives think that what they're doing is bucking authority. They just have different ideas as to who's in charge, right? Or what kind of mindset is in charge. Some of the significant political elements of the 60s include, of course, the sit-ins. They become a prevalent part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Enovid, birth control, was approved by the government, and that changes sexual mores and sexual expectations of sexual relationships. The Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, is formed in 1960, and this launches the New Left, and we'll talk a little bit more about the New Left in a moment. And the civil rights movement enters a bloodier phase. It's not that there wasn't violence in the 1950s. There were dogs in the fire hoses and so on turned on black Americans. But in the 1960s, it becomes ever bloodier. There are moments of outright rebellion. There are the bombings that we'll talk about by elements of the New Left, the Weather Underground, and so on. The whole situation becomes more obviously urgent. In fact, the 60s political style is one of urgency. It's not that there weren't urgent things to concern us in the 1950s, but for the most part, political actors didn't act from a state of urgency. Even when they were doing things to address urgent concerns, there was at least the veneer of a kind of calm approach to it. And in the 70s, you'll see a return to a different kind of calmness, a kind of cynical calmness, a kind of remove. But in the 60s, there was this sense of urgency. And I think that's part of why it gets mythologized in the way that it does, because people look back at the 1960s as this moment when people were involved, when people cared a lot and were willing to show that care. Again, I think that some of this is exaggerated in various ways, but it's an important part of how the 60s saw itself and how people continue to see it. Let's talk about some important books from the 1960s to give us a sense of the period. Notice, by the way, this is the third session, and yet now we're giving an overview of the 60s, and part of this has to do with my own belief that the first couple years of the 1960s are really, in a sense, an extension of the 50s, right? For music, it changes in the ways that we talked about, especially in the first session. It becomes more corporate and so on in the very beginning of the 60s, but it's really a corporatization of the aesthetic of the 50s and the overall cultural aesthetic, the way people dress, the way people act, the political way of doing things, all that continues into the early 60s. We tend to think of JFK as being an important shift, right? And that presidency, which was cut off in 63, as being an important shift in politics, but really it's a continuation in many ways. It's sort of a culmination in many ways of the 1950s and this idea of a kind of hope for renewal within stability. It's really and I don't say this out of a place of disrespect, but it's really his death that is his most important contribution as far as the political scene is concerned, because it's that death that introduces a kind of violence into the political culture, the kind of urgency that we're talking about now. And so I think it's appropriate to talk about an overview of the 60s, even though we're now getting towards 63, 64. So what are some of these books? There's Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities of 1961. This is a book about urban planning, that the idea that urban planning leads to the decline of neighborhoods, and major freeways destroy city life rather than improving it. So the things that we're doing is a sign of progress. They might be leading to our demise, right? So again, the sense of urgency. Moving to novels, you have Joseph Heller's Catch-22 of 1961, which is a comic novel about the inanities of the military in World War II. Now, this is important because it skewers the very notion of war. It's making fun of war. Even the revered World War II, which everyone talks about as the quote-unquote good war, right? And what Catch-22 suggests is that there is no such thing as a good war, that there can't be, that war is always absurd. A group of people killing a group of other people at a distance is always going to be absurd on its face, right? And so this novel serves, even though it's about World War II, it serves as a critique of Vietnam. The third book that I mentioned here, and you can see, is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring of 1962, which warns of the dangers of pesticides and pollution. And this is a key book in the rise of environmentalism and that as a social cause. And we'll see where that goes over the course of the 60s and into the 70s. Let's look at three more books. We have Michael Harrington's The Other America, 1962. Michael Harrington is one of the great socialists in U.S. society. He's a U.S. author who really advocates for socialism and Marxism at a time when it was under a great deal of suspicion after the Second World War. This is a book about poverty and the need for governmental intervention, the idea that the government has certain responsibilities, that it can't be a laissez-faire approach to the world, that it has responsibilities for the care of its citizens rather than going about world domination, which is how Harrington saw Vietnam and other similar efforts. Then we have James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time of 63. Where he predicts that racial politics will become increasingly violent. And many people see this as a prophetic book. And then number 6 is Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique of 1963, right? Which asserts that women require fulfillment outside of the roles of wife and mother. And so it's a key text within the feminist movement. And really what we can think of as the beginning of second wave feminism, where it's no longer about first wave feminism is primarily concerned with issues like voting rights, right? Legal issues. What Friedan is talking about is more about how people are perceived, how they are understood, and then work has a kind of ennobling aspect to it that women are missing out on when they're resigned to the roles of wife and mother. Now, this book comes under some criticism for being focused really on white middle-class women as opposed to a larger movement. But keep in mind, this is still fairly early in second-wave feminism. And so the idea of intersectionalism, that's decades away at this point, even the sort of proto-intersectionalism. So this is quite an early book, which is part of the reason it comes under as much criticism as it does, as people are sort of navigating their own space within feminism. The 60s also are a period of economic boom, right? And you can see here the circularity of that more spending leads to more growth, confidence rises, asset prices rise, which feeds back into higher spending. And it's sort of instead of a vicious cycle, a virtuous cycle, right? This is a good thing until it busts. So the 60s witnessed the longest period in U.S. history of uninterrupted economic growth. Per capita income rose from roughly 2,100 or 2,157 in 1960 to 3,050 in 1970. That's an unprecedented and never repeated 41% increase over the course of a decade, right? While prices remained stable. That was thought of as being impossible. because the idea, you can see it in the little circle. The asset prices are supposed to rise as all this other stuff is going on. But for the most part, prices remain stable over the course of that decade. And economists are still studying that decade to figure out why it happened, right? Poverty dropped from 22% to 12%. And this led to increased expectations. So what earlier generations considered privileges, this generation, the 60s, considers entitlements. They're entitled to these things. And that's part of what leads to very different ways of looking at the political landscape, like the New Left and the demands from, let's say, Michael Harrington for more government intervention into poverty, into homelessness, into medical, illnesses and so on. Healthcare and those kinds of issues. But then you also have the hippies that think that they should be able to live a life that's outside of corporate work, outside of that kind of structure. The hippies aren't advocating no work at all. That's sort of a myth in its own. But they are looking for a kind of fulfillment that they feel that corporate America doesn't offer. And all this naturally sort of effloresces out of the 1960s and its economic stability. This is another way in which the 60s carries on from the 50s, even though it feels like a very different decade. I've already mentioned the issue of Camelot, right? The early 60s especially, this is a time of youth in politics. John F. Kennedy was the youngest president at that time, and his moment there was known posthumously, really, after the fact, in an article or letter written by Jackie Kennedy as Camelot, right? That it was this sort of moment of a peaceful and hopeful kingdom. His inauguration, January 20th, 1961, he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man." So notice already here, this is in some ways a continuation of what I was already saying about the 1950s, that there's a sense here that Americans, that the U.S. has a responsibility toward the freedom of man. That it's not just about what America does for you, but what you're doing. Not just for America, but for the world at large, right? The freedom of man. He hired highly educated men as advisors, including several Republicans, several people that were politically not of his agenda. And he thought of his administration as a think tank, as opposed to, say, the Eisenhower hierarchy, where it really was a clear hierarchy. So he's sort of flattening that hierarchy to a certain extent. He's still in charge, of course, but he's looking for more expert input. And this becomes the way that government really, at least ostensibly, works from that point on, administrations. But the missteps, come early. In 1961, April 1961, there's the disaster of the Bay of Pigs, where he has the CIA fund a group of Cubans who have left Cuba, and they attack Cuba to try to topple Castro and the threat of communism there. And of course, that leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis and all the rest of it. So his popularity remains incredibly high. He's considered the first television president. He has televised press conferences. Many people think that that's part of why he won against Nixon, was that he was so telegenic. He was so attractive in that sense. And, it's hard to judge a presidency that didn't last a full term, of course, because he was assassinated in 1963. But to some extent, that idea of the hope that he represented isn't the whole story. Let's continue. The country was suffused with this sense of hope, renewal, prosperity. There was a zeal to solve social ills and to defeat the communist threat. And I think there's a juxtaposition there, right? Communism and socialism, which are not the same thing, they often get sort of considered the same thing, especially during the 50s and early 60s. So on the one hand, you want government and policy to solve social ills, but you don't want it to seem too much like socialism, right? Well, programs like Social Security and any attempt toward some kind of subsidized healthcare, those are socialist projects, but at least within the rhetoric of U.S. ideology, you have to avoid that conflation. Now, the latter part, the defeat of the communist threat, even though JFK is sometimes credited with pursuing the resolution of social ills. That really wasn't his main concern, as you can see very clearly in interviews and in conversations in his biographies and so on that he had with other people. He was really interested in being a strong opposition to what he revealed, thought of as the communist threat. Now, he's so popular, and was so popular and remains so popular, that many people give him credit for successes in domestic and foreign policy, but he didn't really earn that so well. His relations with Cuba were not ideal, right? He was reluctant to pursue civil rights. He didn't want to lose Southern votes. So his relationship to Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, was very standoffish in some ways. It's not that he didn't interact with him at all, but he was very careful. He actively tried to suppress both the Freedom Rides and the March on Washington. He was not in support of Martin Luther King's going to Washington. And of course, we'll look at the March on Washington. It was bigger than just Martin Luther King, but we'll talk about that as we continue. When he failed to stop the March on Washington and the Freedom Rides were the buses of African Americans and other civil rights workers that were going through the South, basically propagandizing for civil rights. When he failed to stop those things, he tried to turn both to his advantage. He basically tried to take credit for things that he didn't really do. His tax cut was ill-advised, but the economy kept going, right? Even though it wasn't a good, all economic authorities say that tax cut was a bad idea. And yet, because the boom continued, he was given credit again for the economy. No one knows why the economy was that good, right? Like I said, economists are still studying that era. The Bay of Pigs was an outright disaster, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was a barely averted disaster, but it got played off as a demonstration of his mettle and wisdom. So I'm not trying to be disrespectful toward JFK, but he does have this image that I think is worth debunking, because it tells us something about this moment, that the U.S. needed a president that seemed strong and vigorous and youthful, even though he had all sorts of problems, even with his vigor, right? He was on quite a few drugs, painkillers from injuries that he sustained during the war. And people still think of this as a golden era, and it's really image over reality. And it was a part of the sort of the propaganda of the ideology of the U.S. state. And we can see that even with the end of this period of Camelot. This is, of course, one of the most famous pictures, really, in U.S. presidential history. This is from his funeral service. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and the country reeled, right? People from that generation, everyone knows where they were when they heard the news. Right? My mother and my father can tell me with great detail where they were when they heard it and what was going on. It seemed to many people like the loss of innocence. Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president, took office, and he was far more successful on domestic issues, but he never gained the popularity. He's one of the most hated presidents, really, of that period, until obviously Nixon sort of beats everyone on the hated president level. But JFK was not personally, or Lyndon B. Johnson was not personally popular at all. And yet, as far as actual legal work that was done, legislative work rather, he accomplished a lot more than JFK. But this photograph is very famous, with two of his brothers flanking his widow, and she's got the veil on, and then of course his son offering a salute. Okay. So let's switch over. That gives us some of the U.S. context, and we're going to come back to the U.S. in a moment. But let's switch over to the U.K. for a moment to get a sense of where the Beatles start, and then we'll see their impact, because they come to the U.S. just after, not very long after, the assassination of JFK, and I think that's significant in several ways. This is again a contested point. Historians disagree, but we'll talk about what I think when we get there. So, the formation of the Beatles. March of 1957, a 16-year-old John Lennon puts together a skiffle group. A skiffle group is kind of like folk music meets the UK version of jazz, of kind of early ragtimey-ish jazz. And he puts together this skiffle group in Liverpool. At first they're called the Blackjacks and then the Quarrymen. Paul McCartney joins as a guitarist, not the bass player at first, in July, and then George Harrison joins in March of 1958 as the lead guitarist. George Harrison, I think he was 14 or something at the time he joined, incredibly young. In January of 59, John Lennon enrolls at the Liverpool College of Art, and he meets the painter, Stuart Sutcliffe, and Sutcliffe joins on bass, and they create a band that they call, Sutcliffe's idea, the Silver Beatles, right? That's in honor of Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and then just the Beatles. And by the way, the picture in the last frame was the focus was on Stuart Sutcliffe, and we're not going to see him again, so that's who that was. They wind up going to Hamburg in August of 1960. Alan Williams, who's their sort of unofficial manager, he books them into an extended stay in Hamburg, Germany. Pete Best is the drummer at this time, and they're in Germany for 3.5 months, and they really see this as sort of an incubating period for them. They're mostly a cover band at this time. They're playing covers of rock and roll, of Chuck Berry. They're playing covers of Motown records that are coming out. And 1960 is a little early for Motown, but by 62, they're playing Motown covers. They're playing Brill Building songs, a lot of cover tunes, right? In 1961, they go back to Hamburg, and it's this period when they start with the mop haircuts. So this new style that they're developing. Stuart Sutcliffe leaves the band in order to do more art studies, and McCartney switches to bass. And for a brief period of time, they're on Polydor Records, mostly as a backing band for Tony Sheridan, right? And they have a small hit with him, My Bonnie, which was number 32 on the Music Markt chart, which is a German billboard, basically. Then in 1961, they start playing at the Cavern, right? The Cavern is a nightclub that is very associated with their development. And here you can see them; they're still wearing the leather jackets. They have sort of an early version of the mop haircut. You can see it best on George Harrison there. You can also see that it's still Pete Best on the drums. They become associated with the Mercy Beat movement, sometimes called beat music, which is coming out of Liverpool, right? In November, they meet at the Cavern Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein runs a record store, a very popular record store, and he has a sort of small label. And he hears about this group that people are coming in and asking about their music, and so he goes to see them. And in January of 1962, they hire Epstein as their manager. He gets them signed to EMI, and they're going to be produced by George Martin, who at first doesn't want to do it. George Martin is a great music engineer, a recording engineer. He's working on some popular music and a lot of classical music. He's not particularly interested in the Beatles. He thinks that it's a bad idea to pursue them as hard as Epstein wants to pursue them. Epstein changes their image so that they're getting the more uniform haircuts, the matching suits, right? So no longer the leather jackets that they have in this photograph. They released Love Me Do in 1962, which becomes the number 17 on the UK charts. That's their first release. And then they replaced Pete Best on drums with Ringo Starr. Following Martin's request, George Martin's not that into Pete Best, and he thinks that they need another member that's sort of outgoing the way that the main three Beatles are, and that's what Ringo really is good at the press. George Martin doesn't think that much of Ringo either, though, as far as being a drummer, at least not at first. Ringo has a great sense of time. He's metronomic in some ways, but he doesn't have Ringo play on some of the early recordings because he doesn't feel like Ringo's as good of a drummer as he might be. That, of course, changes. George Martin created most of the string and orchestral arrangements for most of the Beatles' careers. So the string parts that you hear on Eleanor Rigby and so on, those are arranged by George Martin. He's also responsible for the studio sound that they achieve. And so, different people get called the fifth Beatle all the time. And so some people say, well, it's Brian Epstein because he's the one that really gave them their image and really promoted them and made them huge. It's Brian Epstein that's responsible in some ways for Beatlemania. Some people say it's George Martin because George Martin, of course, really creates the sound. And as we'll see, as they move into the studio and become more of a studio band, that might be a good argument, right, for that. And other people, like Billy Preston, keyboard player, also get called the fifth Beatle at various times. And that's such a typical line, the notion of the fifth Beatle, that there's an SNL skit with Eddie Murphy who claims to be the fifth Beatle. And you can look that up on YouTube. Here they are, Brian Epstein with his head in his hand, and then George Martin sort of towering above him. Obviously, both very concerned with business. They're both very business-oriented people, professionals, and they're trying to take the Beatles, this sort of rock and roll cover band with leather jackets and so on, and they're trying to turn them into a business. So the first big hits, 1963 is the beginning of Beatlemania, right? And they have hits with the album Please Please Me, and then later Meet the Beatles. Their first number one UK single was in March of 63, and that's From Me to You. In October of 21 is the first use of the term Beatlemania in the Daily Mail. And then they have 3 more number one hits on the UK charts, culminating in I Want to Hold Your Hand. This also became their first hit in the US. It was a number one in the US just prior to their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. They have 4 national tours in the UK during 1963, and the hysteria for them grew. They often had trouble hearing themselves play over the screaming, right? Their amplification simply wasn't equal to it. And you can read a analysis that I have of one of their early hits, Please Please Me, for an analysis of their approach to both songwriting and production and the sort of coy lyrics that are clearly referring to sex without ever being explicit about it. So therefore it's, accessible. It's all the things that we talked about with respect to American Bandstand and so on, that they're approachable enough that they're not alienating the older generation. And again, you'll see conflicting statements about this. Some people think, especially given reflection, will say that, the Beatles came to the Ed Sullivan Show and everything changed, right? Well, not really. They're building on a lot of the pop formulas that are already out there. They're just doing it very well, of course, and they have a sort of charm of otherness that I think is important in 64, and we'll talk about that in just a moment when they arrive in the U.S. But at the same time, they're building on very familiar tropes. They're just giving back to the U.S. things that already were here in the U.S., but with just a tinge of otherness, right? It's later that the revolution, if you want to call it that, occurs. It's later that they become something else, and we're going to chart that in a moment. Here's a great photograph of Beatlemania in the UK. You can see the British officers trying to hold back the throng of mostly women, pushing forward, trying to break through the barrier, and the cop in the very front is having a hard time of it. The U.S. record industry is sagging in the late 50s, or rather in the early 60s, coming out of the late 50s. Between 55 and 59, the record industry doubled in size. Right? But in 1960, it drops 5%. So it's not a total loss by any means. 5% is not huge, but it's sagging a bit. It had all this growth from 55 to 59 because of the rock and roll phenomenon. And then with that first generation disappearing, and with the sort of anodyne version of rock and roll that we see in the Brill Building and that we see in American Bandstand, it begins to dip. But after 64, with the arrival of the Beatles, there's double-digit growth every year until the early 1970s. Every year. That's unheard of. That's a huge expansion. The music industry becomes a major force within American business. And it's partly because of the British invasion, and then the Motown reaction to the British invasion, and then other rock bands in the U.S.'s reaction to the British invasion. So the Beatles began appearing on U.S. radio, specifically in Washington, D.C. at first, right? There's I forget the name of the DJ, but who was distant friends with Epstein, and he starts playing it, and he creates a sort of local interest in songs like Please Please Me. And so they began appearing more and more on U.S. radio in December of 1963. Remember that in November of 1963 was the assassination of JFK. So it's right during this period where people feel hopeless, where people feel like something about that youth culture that JFK represented has been defeated, has been violently snuffed out, that they're emerging within that void, within that gap. Now, again, this is a controversial point among historians. Some people say that that point gets exaggerated. That's one where I don't think it is exaggerated. I think that the Beatles and that youthful, I mean, they're dressed in suits. They have this somewhat strange haircut, the mop haircut that makes them seem youthful, but not threatening. It's not long hair. It's not really rebellious hair, right? The rebellion of the early Beatles, that's what I think gets exaggerated. They're not coming across as rebellious. They're coming across as very acceptable and accepting, and they're drawing on influences from Motown. They're drawing on influences from the Brill Building, influences of earlier rock and roll, influences of Tin Pan Alley, of English Music Hall, which is sort of the English version of Tin Pan Alley, and their skiffle roots and all of that. So they're this hybrid group that's drawing on all this various popular stuff, and they have a really refined, I think, pop sensibility. They know how to write a good song. That's what Paul McCartney and John Lennon become known as, great songwriters, where they're writing for other bands as well. And they have a pop sensibility that really fits with an older model, the Tin Pan Alley model, where you have the AABA structure. And they're very interested in the middle eight. Sometimes they will even construct the B section separately, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the Beatles begin appearing on the radio in December of 63, and they're a huge hit, but there are no commercial copies yet available of these singles. And then Capitol Records, which is owned by EMI, releases some of their singles early and become a number one by mid-January. And that was I Want to Hold Your Hand, of course. They arrive at JFK Airport. It was just named JFK. It was just renamed. They arrive in February of 1964. Remember that it was only 2 months or 3 months prior to this, November. So I guess it depends on how you count back, but 3 months, I guess. Late November 22nd, that he was assassinated. And now already the airport's named for him, and they're arriving in February of 64. They arrive on the 7th, and there are 4,000 fans awaiting them. You can see some of them in the background. You can see some officials from the airport. On the 9th, 2 days later, they're on the Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million people, roughly 2/5 of the American population, were watching that show, according to statistics. Now, granted, it's harder in that era to know for certain, but that's the estimation, that it was roughly 2/5 of the American population. April of 64, all 5 of the top 5 songs are theirs in April of 64. They had 28 songs on the charts that year alone. And for 3 weeks, 60% of all record sales were singles by the Beatles. 60% of the industry in 64 for 3 weeks during April was the Beatles. This sets off the British invasion, and 1/3 of all top 10 hits in the U.S. throughout 1964 were by British bands. Now remember that 1964 is also the year where there's no distinction between R&B and pop. And some people, some critics, feel that that's why there's less of a black presence, that the R&B chart allowed for more crossover. So you needed that chart, because as people were coming up on the chart, then they were able to cross over better. And then by getting rid of that chart, you were de-emphasizing black radio and black audiences and black record stores, and that turned out to the detriment of most recording artists. The exception, Motown. Motown found that sweet spot of appealing to white audiences, as we discussed last time. Let's keep moving. Over 30 top 40 hits, 12 number ones, And all their studio albums reached number one on the album charts. So this is a huge band. 1963 through 68, they sold roughly 154 million records, 154 million worldwide. August of 1964, they released A Hard Day's Night as a movie, right? It was directed by Richard Lester, and it depicts a kind of parodic version of Beatlemania. And the notion of the Beatles is a joyously rebellious victims of their own fame. And you can see a clip from it there where they're running and the cops are behind them trying to protect them from the fans. And also you can see the movie poster. The soundtrack was on the album charts for 56 weeks, 14 weeks at number one. Then another movie, a lesser film, and that's Help, of course, in July of 65. And then in August 15, they have a show at New York City's Shea Stadium, and there you can see a picture of it where they can't be heard, right? It was the first time a large outdoor stadium was used for a concert, and there were so many people that they just drowned them out. It sold out in 17 minutes, 55,000 people. It's also one of their last live shows. And there are several reasons for this. One is simply they couldn't be heard. But then also, about a year or so later, in June of 66, they're touring West Germany. So they're still touring. They're touring Japan and the Philippines. There were mob revolts. There was a threat from the First Lady of the Philippines, Imelda Marcos, and threats of arrest and assassination. They were too popular for their own good to a certain extent. In August of that year, they're back in the U.S. for what will be their final tour, just after the release of Revolver. And we'll talk about Revolver in a moment. Lennon made the famous remark that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Now, he says he meant this in a different way, that he was saying that in a way popular culture is misfocused, right? He wasn't saying that they deserved to be more popular or bigger than Jesus. But this caused a huge fundamentalist backlash, especially in the south of the U.S. And so you can see the burning of records. You can see that in the upper left. Dump your Beatles trash here, right? And people are throwing their records into the fire. There's in the upper right is where Lennon is trying to explain his comments. You can see some more protests. Jesus died for you, John Lennon, and Jesus loves you, and so on. These various protests against the Beatles. And now they basically withdraw from that kind of presence in the public, and they become a studio band. And we'll talk about the impact of that in a moment. Of course, to fill that void, there's a cartoon, right? As they become more introverted, more reflective in the studio, they become a studio band. They remain popular and influential, but they're no longer the pop-oriented hit they were before. But the studios adapt. There's the Beatles cartoon in 1965, and you can see a frame from that. And then, of course, the Monkees in 1966, which is basically a version of the Beatles based on their earlier image, the mop top image, done more or less in the model of the Marx Brothers kind of loony, zany television program. Let's stick a little longer with the early Beatles and talk about form. I mentioned that they're great songwriters, more or less in the Tin Pan Alley style, right? Many of their early originals are based on that style. Usually the main part of the song will have 4 phrases, each generally roughly 2 measures long. Usually 2 measures long is the standard, right? The first phrase, so let's take From Me to You as an example, right? If there's anything that you want, right? If there's anything that you want, it would be that opening statement. And then that's followed by a repetition, sometimes varied, sometimes exact. So if there's anything I can do, right? So it starts with the same exact gesture. It ends a little differently, but it's basically the same thing. So that's a statement and a repetition. And then you have a departure, something that's different. Just call on me and I'll send it along, right? That contrasts in several ways. You might notice, you'll notice it better if you listen to their version, of course, that you have a blue note in there, right? The opening part, do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, has the major third, but then that do-do-do-do, just that little bit of a blue note, right? That helps to mark it as a departure. And then in conclusion, send it along, da-da, from me to you, right? A cadential thing. So you have SRDC, statement, restatement, or revision if it's changed, departure, conclusion. Now, altogether, we consider this the large A section. So that's what we just heard. We heard the opening A section. If there's anything that you want, if there's anything I can do, just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you, right? And then what happens in the song? That gets repeated with different words, but it gets repeated. So it's a second A section. And then that contrasts in the large sense with a B section. With the I've got arms to do in that particular song, right? New melody. Sometimes it's called the middle eight. That's what they often called it, the middle eight, and that's a traditional term for it that goes way back in jazz and Tin Pan Alley history. Now, and then the song comes back to the opening, the A. So we have A, B, A in the large sense. Sometimes part of the A will be used as a codetta or whatever, but mostly, and sometimes you repeat things, like you'll have A, B, A, and then maybe there's a guitar solo and then B, A again, or whatever. But the basic form is A, B, A to many of their songs. Now, that formula, the SRDC formula, remember the A section, which is 8 measures long. So again, let's think of it this way. The AABA, the large section, each section is 8 measures long. So an 8 measure 8A section, another 8 measure A section, an 8 measure B section, another 8 measure A section. Now the SRDC, that can create phrase formal situations that we might think of as with small letters, AABA, like A Hard Day's Night works that way, or No Reply, or the song we just talked about, right, where you have that kind of that was From Me to You. You can also have AABB, so I Will, or You Like Me Too Much, or Day Tripper, all have that. Or you can have AABC. So, for instance, I'll Cry Instead. And this is their most common. 8 Days a Week, The Night Before, Helter Skelter, Come Together, all have that kind of. So the SRDC here is flexible, right? Can manifest in different ways. Now, because the A sections are the main hooks of the tunes and sometimes begin with the title phrase, like It's Been a Hard Day's Night or I'm Looking Through You, they establish the energy and provide the popular appeal of the song from the beginning. At times, the SRDC works as a verse-refrain structure, with DC or just C being the refrain, the title line. B sections are almost always ending on the dominant chord as a way to necessitate the return of the A section. There are some exceptions to that. For instance, the B section of No Reply doesn't end on dominant, but that's partly because the verse, or the A section, doesn't begin on the tonic. It begins on the 4 chord, so the B section winds up ending on the tonic. But then, as I mentioned, with these two albums, Rubber Soul and then Revolver, they're moving away from being a singles-oriented band toward being a studio-oriented band. Rubber Soul was released on the 3rd of December 1965, and it features pretty markedly different instrumental forces. They're drawing on psychedelia at this point, right? So you have the sitar for Norwegian Wood, you have the harmonium, the fuzz bass on Think for Yourself. The album is treated not simply as a collection of songs, which is what an album has traditionally been, but rather as a full artistic statement. Now, how true is that of Rubber Soul? You listen, you decide. But Rubber Soul does have a kind of, even though it still has pretty disparate songs, it has a kind of aesthetic that carries through on it. That it's clearly influenced by the Byrds, who were seen as a kind of competition for the Beatles at this time. It has elements of what we might call a pantonal planing of 3-part root position triads, where they're all moving in parallel motion, and that's something that the Byrds really developed, and that the Beatles are adapting here. George Martin recorded the Bach-like piano part for In My Life. He did it at half speed. If you listen to it, it sounds like a harpsichord when they speed it up. And that gives there's a sort of neo-Baroque element to that song because of it, which fits with the times. The mid-60s were a period of neo-Baroque songs like Lover's Concerto by the Toys and so on. In short, the recording studio is thought of as an instrument in its own right. They're experimenting with that instrument just like they might work with the guitar or something else. They're really working on creating these soundscapes. Now, that becomes even more the case in the next album, which was released on August 5th, 1966, and that's this album, of course, Revolver. Revolver ends with one of the great studio experiments of that time, Tomorrow Never Knows. And that song was more or less improvised. The song itself is based around just an E major chord pedal throughout, and then he's singing lines from the Tibetan Book of the Dead in it. And what's going on around it, you'll hear these almost like seagull sounds and so on. That's George Martin and John Lennon experimenting with tape in the studio, creating various tape effects. And basically they let the track play as the band recorded it, and then they do things over it. Right, there's backward guitar on it as well, and backward guitar on other parts of the album. So more and more experimentation with the sounds and the studio techniques. This really culminates in some ways in the next album, the very celebrated Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Some people think of this as the sort of quintessential. It's certainly not the first, but it really is one of the most important concept albums of the period. This was released on 26th May, 1967. It's one of the first albums, if not the first, to include the lyrics inside the album, on the album sleeve. Right, and it's also very important in the history of concept albums, in the history of cover design. And you can see the very elaborate cover here, where you have the Beatles dressed in their Sgt. Pepper's outfits, and then just to the left of them is the Beatles in their older style. You have various religious figures. You have Marilyn Monroe. You have the drums of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles written out in flowers, almost like it's a funeral arrangement, or at least some people believe that. Edgar Allan Poe's head is sort of sticking up in the middle back. W.C. Fields is in there. Bob Dylan, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the great tape classical composer, experimentalist. Several figures are back there, both from the past and from the present, as though they're all sort of joined together in this bigger aesthetic, or however you want to think of it. The idea that they have the lyrics there, notice that that's a very important element as well. The lyrics in pop music are generally thought of as being ephemeral, as being not a very important poetic statement. But they meet Bob Dylan in, I forget what year, I think 63, maybe 64. No, 63 is too early. It would have to be 64 or 65. They meet Bob Dylan, and they begin to think more about their lyrics, right? The kind of seriousness that he brings to his lyrics, they want in theirs. And so printing all the lyrics on the album sleeve is this sign that they're taking those lyrics more seriously. They want them to be fully understood and thought about and considered, right? And of course, the whole album is a kind of loose concept album. We'll talk about stricter concept albums or tighter concept albums later, but the whole thing is supposed to be a performance by this mythical band, Sgt. Pepper's, and so you have their sort of theme song at the beginning, and then that comes back at the end as a kind of framing device. Then there's a song, Day in a Life, which is after the end, so it's a kind of coda. It's coming from beyond the void, or whatever you want to think of it. It's one of the most interesting songs on the album, in my opinion, but it's outside of that framework, right? So even that's kind of interesting, that even the frame gets kind of busted in this concept album. And the songs relate to each other in some ways, and in some ways they're looser, right? There's the Mr. Kite and so on, the kind of carnivalesque elements that show up. Then there are the more intimate moments, like she's leaving home and so on. There are still the elements of English music hall. When I'm 64 is a good example of that. So again, a lot of variety, but somehow bringing it together as one album, all tinged with psychedelia. Even though in some ways their most psychedelic track of that time, Strawberry Fields Forever, which was produced at the same time, it's not on the album. So you can see they're still interested in singles. That was released as a single. It's not on the album, but it's very much of that aesthetic, very much of that psychedelic feel. I was trying to get it so you could see the cover a little better, but instead I wound up cutting off most of the heads that I might have wanted to talk about. You can see Marlon Brando, though, if you look right above the older Ringo's head. There's Marlon Brando, and there are several other movie actors interspersed throughout. The White Album was released on 22nd of November 1968. This is not thought of usually as a concept album, although maybe it should be, but it's a kind of, if it is a concept album, a kind of strange one because it's one of their most eclectic works, which makes it, you know, to some people, one of the favorite parlor games, at least among Beatles fanatics, is to say, well, if we were to make this not a double album, if we were to make it into a single album, what would you keep, right? And what would you get rid of to make it a nice, coherent, good album? I always fail at that game because I like almost every track, except for the one sung by Ringo, of course. I like just about every track on this. Actually, I even like some of those on this album. But it is a very varied work of art, drawing in very different styles and keeping them fairly distinct. It's also, in some ways, the beginning and the end for them. They wrote much of this while they were on a retreat with a religious figure, a Swami, who they felt let them down in various ways, and they're drifting ever further apart in their sensibilities, both with respect to how they live their lives, but also with respect to how they write their songs. So they begin working on an album called Let It Be, that they basically have a breakdown during and can't finish. And so they decide they want one more album that feels more coherent. And so that's the next one, which is Abbey Road. Abbey Road's released on the 26th of September, 1969. It's the last album that they released while they're still a group. They then break up, and they'll release Let It Be later, and we'll talk about that on the next slide very briefly. But Abbey Road is, again, a kind of concept album, especially the second side, where they literally link songs together into this suite of tunes. So it has a kind of narrative progression through it. And it's one of the great moments, really, in recorded history, as far as, it's not that those individual songs are necessarily their best songs. It's the way that they're linked together, the way that they manage to flow over. And, of course, Abbey Road also includes some of their best songs, like Come Together and She's So Heavy, and several other tunes, but those are two of my favorites. Finally, of course, is Let It Be. Let's take a look at this. Let It Be was the album that really led to their downfall in some ways. Most of the Beatles were at various times very unhappy with how it turned out. Phil Spector tried to resurrect it. He tried to remaster it in order to sort of produce it after the fact. And, you know, Paul McCartney, for instance, blamed him for some of the problems with it. It's a very uneven album. It has some great Paul McCartney tunes on it. Long and Winding Road is, I think, one of his great compositions. But it's an uneven album overall. There are some people who really love it, of course, but I don't think that it stands up in the same way. But what it does do, or actually what all these albums do, is they demonstrate a very important shift that's happening here, where what we're doing is we're thinking of not songs in the way that Phil Spector did early on in the Brill Building in Motown, songs as being the vehicle of art, songs as being these little, as Phil Spector put it, teenage symphonies. Now the symphonic element is the multi-movement thing of the album itself, right? And so the album, each of these albums, with maybe the exception of Let It Be, but certainly Abbey Road, the White Album, Sgt. Pepper's Revolver, and Rubber Soul, those were all statements. They were meant to be cohesive statements. We can argue as to just how cohesive they were, how well all the songs fit together, what tracks don't belong and what tracks do. That's fine. But the idea is that they are statements, and they were received as such. People weren't that excited about what was coming out on the radio next. They were worried about what the next album was, and the album cover art becomes a big part of it. And you know, all you have to do is research a little bit of the Paul is Dead legend to see how people really read very closely the lyrics and the album art to understand what was perhaps being said behind the scenes, right? So the Beatles were such a big band, they even had their own conspiracy theory. There is this notion that the job of the rock band now wasn't to go on tour we'll see that there are other bands, Allman Brothers, Grateful Dead, that defy this, although both of those bands also made great albums and were concerned with the studio album as art form. But for the most part, the shift in emphasis here is to the recording. And in fact, what happens by the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s is the inverse of what had always been the case. It used to be the case that the album was made just to get people to come out and see you live, right? That the live performance throughout up into the 50s and early 60s, the live performance was the real thing. And then the radio play was the second most important thing. The album was secondary to all that. That was something that the big fans would collect as a collection of singles. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't the main moneymaker. Now, with the Beatles and with the studio albums of the Beach Boys and so on, which we'll talk about next time, the album is becoming the central thing. And record companies are even willing to take a loss on tours. So, for instance, the early Van Halen tours, they lost money on those tours because the albums were going to be the successful money makers. And it was now the inverse of the way it had been, whereas before the tour was the main thing, that was the moneymaker, the albums were secondary and in the supporting role. Now you go on tour in support of an album, and that is an incredibly important shift. And we have really two bands to thank for it. The Beatles, who we talked about today, and the Beach Boys, who we'll talk about next time. See you then.